Now I'd like to invite Kate Zyla, the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center, to speak to us about navigating the emerging federal state landscape on climate and focusing on accelerating climate adaptation and resilience. Thank you, Kate.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the folks at Rutgers for inviting me to join you this morning. I'm trying to not spill that water. Pleasure to see you all this morning. I'm going to pull up my slides here. I first introduce myself, Kate Zyla, Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center, based at Georgetown Law in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to start by sounding a little bit like someone who works at a law school and talk about the sort of general framework of the way that federal and state and local governments work together. Because in the United States, effective responses to the climate change problem depend on action at the federal and the state and the local level. And that's really because of the way that our laws were designed, our energy laws, our environmental laws. They are federalist. They assign explicit roles to each level of government. And the way that we can do best is for all those pieces to work together. All right, so what that means in practice is that when different levels of government collaborate and communicate and align their goals, we can move farther and faster and more effectively at achieving durable, equitable, ambitious climate action for the health and welfare of people across the country. When they're not working together, it's a lot harder because all of those pieces are related and important, but the good news is they don't all have to move at the same time or at the same pace. Different players can step forward and others step back, and that's where we are today, and that's the context we're talking about what New Jersey can do at a time when the federal government is stepping back, but you still have a lot of tools at the state level and the local level to work with. So the Georgetown Climate Center was established in 2009, actually at the request of state officials who are looking for a place to have conversations about the ways that different levels of government work together on climate change. And we work with governments across up and down levels of government, across multiple states at the same level of government, across multiple jurisdictions and multiple agencies within given states, because all of these pieces of the puzzle, I really think that this puzzle metaphor, there's this big puzzle we have to put together and everyone has different pieces. And the question is, what pieces can we put in place at different times and lay the groundwork to put other pieces in later when other people are ready to move. We work on both adaptation and mitigation at the Climate Center. I'm going to focus primarily on adaptation today because Jesse focused on mitigation, but I'm probably not going to be able to resist saying a little bit about mitigation at the end because we really see these as co-equal priorities that have to be built together, thought of together, developed together for effective action. All right, but I'll start with adaptation. So our adaptation program is focused on helping policymakers develop comprehensive adaptation strategies, creating stronger legal frameworks, working on sector-specific programs and goals and standards as well, and building capacity. And I'm showing you here the 4 areas of work that we're currently focused on because these are the things that we really see as the key needs for this field right now. Over on the left, these are really thinking about laws and policies and programs to help minimize putting new developments into places that are really risky and dangerous, and helping the people who are in those places that are more risky and dangerous to find ways to adapt to the risks that they face. We're also focused a lot on public dollars. If you look at the bucket on the right, over the last few years, this has really been about federal money. We heard about the IRA. There's been a lot of federal funding recently for adaptation programs as well as clean energy programs, less so now. But there are also state and local funds that can be deployed for building climate resilience. Governance, over on the bottom left, is really a critical piece of the cross-agency work that needs to be done. If we're going to affect climate risks effectively, they touch so many aspects of our lives, so many sectors, so many programs, so many parts of state government that we have to think about how to work together to really have cohesive, comprehensive strategies. And then finally, we just see this need to work more on the way that we talk about the conversation on adaptation and resilience and what it really means and the way that affects really so much of everything that we do. Which brings me to where we are now. We work with policymakers to help them do better by looking at the interrelatedness of these issues that each level of government is facing and how they depend on each other for success. And now we have a moment where the federal government is stepping back. So what does that mean for New Jersey? Since taking office in January, the Trump administration has implemented substantial rollbacks to federal climate adaptation and programs. Key data sources have been removed, including FEMA's Flood Risk Index tool. floodplain mapping resources, information regarding the community disaster resilience zones that identified 767 high-risk census tracts. The administration has withdrawn from its 25-year role developing disaster-resilient building codes by halting implementation of the federal flood risk management standard, which had required FEMA-funded projects to incorporate climate resilience measures. The federal funding freezes and pauses that Professor Jenkins was just talking about have affected new grants and loans for adaptation, including FEMA's hazard mitigation grant programs, which have been caught up in the uncertainty of states' access to federal funds. And significant staffing cuts have affected climate adaptation capacity across multiple agencies. We've seen folks, staffing reduced at FEMA that helped focus on low-income communities secure disaster mitigation grants. We've seen programs at the Forest Service cut that worked on wildfire prevention, including $2 billion of funding that also came through the IRA. At HUD, the Office of Community Planning and Development, which manages post-disaster rebuilding efforts, has been significantly cut, limiting the federal capacity to support communities that are facing increasingly frequent climate disasters. This week, folks who are catching the news, there was another executive order, this one titled Achieving Efficiency Through State and Local Preparedness, focused on climate resilience. States it is the policy of the United States that state and local governments and individuals play a more active and significant role in national resilience and preparedness. The order requires officials to develop a national resilience strategy, to revise critical infrastructure policies, to create a national risk register to quantify threats, and streamline the, quote, complicated lens of overlapping and overbroad functions, unquote, in federal preparedness systems. The executive order seems to signal a step back from the president's prior rhetoric on eliminating FEMA entirely, but it represents the beginning of a significant restructuring of the country's disaster response framework, and likely means a lot more attention and a lot more responsibility moving down to the state and local level. So what does that mean? One, it means that this work is harder. We really needed and used and depended on the federal data and the federal money and the federal programs and guidance. But it also means the work is more important. The state-led climate action is now absolutely necessary, not just valuable. These federal rollbacks have created gaps that you all in New Jersey and other states and communities will need to fill. The good news is that in New Jersey, you have done actually quite a lot of really remarkable work on climate adaptation and resilience. And I want to say a few things about some of the really fabulous programs you all have in place to build on, some of which were some of those data points on the timelines that Clint showed earlier. So let me, pull up a few of these. The way that we think about roles of strong state leadership on climate change, adaptation, and resilience are really about cross-agency, all-of-government approaches. And New Jersey has done quite a lot to take on this approach. You have, well, I'll say first of all, one of the things we think is really important, and then I will say in a minute that you all have done nicely, is to think about governance, and in particular to create a chief resilience officer for the state, to think about funding and creating diverse funding streams for projects that go beyond basic safety measures, and to think about comprehensive master planning that integrates climate resilience across all sectors. So these put together create the framework that we really look to as we think about what states can do more on to advance climate resilience. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into a couple of these, including ones that you all are doing a really nice job on. This is a report that the Georgetown Climate Center put out recently, authored by our adaptation director, Josh Sachs, who you'll hear from later today. And it looks at 12 different states that have developed through some form or another chief resilience officers for their state. And the CRO is a senior government official who's responsible for coordinating climate resilience efforts across the state government, across agencies, across jurisdictions, developing comprehensive resilience strategies, and ensuring that investments and policies mitigate climate-related risks for as many people as possible in the state. Unlike traditional emergency management roles, these folks focus primarily on pre-disaster planning and long-term resilience rather than just focusing on immediate disaster response after something has gone wrong. New Jersey established a chief resilience officer in 2019 through executive order. One of the things we noticed on that timeline was that many of your actions have actually come through executive order, which I think offers some opportunities for legislative action to really solidify some of these actions and policies and programs and positions. In New Jersey, you've placed that role within the Department of Environmental Protection, which is a common place to put these and gives access to environmental agency resources and grants, federal funding like EPA water grants, land and conservation fund dollars. And you'll see that if you take a look at this report, that's one of the models we look at. We look at many other states as well. Different states put these in different places, give them different jobs, give them different responsibilities. And there may be some other pieces to learn from other states there as well. But we talk about your work. Let me get a little drink of water here. We talk about your CRO and the executive order and some of the ways that the directions to the CRO have also been really helpful in establishing the comprehensiveness of this role, including requirements to develop a scientific report on climate change and a statewide climate resilience change strategy. Another piece that was on Clint's timeline that we think is really remarkable for New Jersey is the Blue Acres program, which is really a leader nationally on climate change, resilience, and adaptation. The Blue Acres program started in 1995 and pioneered strategic property buyouts for flood mitigation. The funding comes from diverse sources. It pulls funding from a state corporate business tax, it pulls funding from FEMA, HUD, USDA programs, and really sort of came together, in particular after the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, identified the urgent need for comprehensive flood strategies. And Blue Acres delivers one of the most effective strategies for actually responding to climate risks, which is taking people who are in particularly vulnerable places and helping them move somewhere else. It's a voluntary buyout program that both helps bring people to safer places and also restores and protects the land that is left behind to build resilience of the ecosystem. Another program on Clint's timeline demonstrating real climate leadership is the Supporting Resilient Environments and Landscapes, or REAL initiative, launched as part of Governor Murphy's New Jersey Pact, Protecting Against Climate Threats directive in 2020. So we have governance, we have funding, now we have a regulatory approach. The initiative here strengthens regulatory frameworks by adjusting coastal flood hazard areas to account for sea level rise, creating inundation risk zones to protect critical infrastructure, improving stormwater management, and encouraging nature-based solutions. And so when you put these pieces together, you have these different components, the governance and leadership at the institutional level, the funding from diverse sources, including federal, but not exclusively federal, and a regulatory piece to really lock in some of these changes and policies and programs. So that's to say, really good job, New Jersey. Thank you. You're doing well, but there's one piece we want to encourage you to do a little bit more of, and that's to think about the, I'm going to put this down on the keyboard, oh, it's okay, the spatial planning aspect of this. And we talked about the Energy Master Plan. We'd like to encourage you all to think a bit more about the spatial planning framework that can help New Jersey think about where your climate risks are and what you want to do about them in a physical level. And so we've seen some states, Louisiana has a coastal master plan, some regions, Norfolk, Virginia has a Vision 2100. New Jersey could follow this model and benefit from a comprehensive spatial planning framework to identify what areas in the state you really want to protect, what areas in the state you really need to think about accommodating increased flooding or other hazards, what area of the state you really don't want to encourage people to develop further in, and whether people need to move away from certain developments over time. You can do that in the plan in a way that gives you a public conversation to talk about all of these issues with people in New Jersey and identify your priorities and how you respond in different places. Without that detailed approach, neighborhood planning level strategic investments suffer. The communities face uncertainty about their increasing climate risks, and without this, local governments, property owners, and infrastructure planners don't really know where to put things and where not to put things. So one bit of encouragement for New Jersey to think more about the spatial piece. And then I will leave you with just one thought. I can't not talk about mitigation a little bit. People know that I can't stand in front of a microphone and not talk in particular about transportation. Jesse talked a lot about clean energy, and there's a lot of barriers right now. There's a lot of hurdles. There's a lot of costs. There's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety about federal action. Transportation emissions, as Marjorie mentioned, are the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New Jersey and in the country overall. You all have done a lot on transportation as well. You are leaders on electric vehicle deployment and infrastructure funding. There's a lot of uncertainty now about the way that federal law will treat the authority that states, including New Jersey, have to adopt standards for vehicles. But I want to point you all to one other piece of federal funding, which is transportation funding. And it's not just federal funding. Your funding in New Jersey is, let's see, less than 25% from federal sources. The rest of your transportation funding is state and local money, which you have discretion to spend however you like. You also have enormous discretion how you spend the federal money. The federal transportation funds, the formula funds in particular, not just the discretionary funds, have enormous flexibility in statute for states to decide how to spend their money, including on electric vehicle charging stations, on bike and pedestrian infrastructure, strategies that reduce emissions and build communities. And I encourage you all to think about the tools that you still have in your toolbox, including federal money, including state and local money, and including the legislation you can put in place to really firm up all these executive orders that did all this wonderful work on the timeline. There's still a lot you can do, so thank you.